The letter arrived on a day when the sky hung low and brooding, its gray expanse a portent of the darkness to come. William Hargrave stood at his apartment window, the crisp paper trembling in his hands as he read the words that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. Dearest William, it is with profound sorrow that I must inform you of the passing of your brother Marcus. The circumstances of his demise are uncertain. Your presence is required at Ebon Hollow post-haste. There are matters of grave importance we must discuss. Yours faithfully, Jeremiah Crow, family solicitor. William's grip tightened, crumpling the edges of the letter. Marcus dead? It seemed impossible. They had not spoken in years, their relationship fractured by time and unspoken resentments. But the thought of his younger brother's life snuffed out so suddenly left an ache in his chest he could not ignore. Ebon Hollow. The name alone sent a shiver down his spine, conjuring memories of a childhood steeped in shadows and whispers. The ancestral Hargrave estate loomed large in his mind's eye, a decrepit mansion of weathered stone and rotting wood, its windows like hollow eyes staring out over the mist-shrouded marshlands that surrounded it. He had sworn never to return, yet now fate conspired to draw him back into the orbit of that accursed place. As he began to pack his meager belongings, William's thoughts turned to the stories that had circulated about Ebon Hollow for generations. Tales of madness that gripped the Hargrave line, of unexplained disappearances and eerie phenomena that defied rational explanation. Superstitious nonsense, he muttered to himself, but the words rang hollow in the stillness of his apartment. As night fell, William boarded a train bound for the countryside, unaware that with each passing mile, he drew closer not just to his family's estate, but to horrors beyond his darkest imaginings. The rhythmic clacking of the wheels on the track seemed to whisper a warning, a mantra that echoed in his mind as he drifted into an uneasy slumber. The house is alive, the house is alive, the house is alive. In his fitful dreams, William saw Ebon Hollow rising from the mists, its walls pulsing like a beating heart, waiting to enfold him in its malevolent embrace. The train lurched to a halt with a screech of metal on metal, jolting William from his restless slumber. He blinked, disoriented, as the mournful cry of the engine whistle pierced the pre-dawn gloom. Outside the window, a desolate platform materialized from the mist. Blackmore Station, the closest stop to Ebon Hollow. As William disembarked, the chill air clung to him like a shroud. The platform was deserted save for a solitary figure hunched beneath a flickering gas lamp. The man's face was hidden beneath the brim of a worn cap, but as William approached, he lifted his head, revealing features etched with age and sorrow. Etched. Mr. Hargrave, I presume. The old man's voice was a dry rasp. I'm Silas, caretaker of Ebon Hollow. I've come to fetch you to the estate. William nodded, suppressing a shudder as he followed Silas to an ancient black carriage. The horses stamped nervously, their breath forming ghostly plumes in the cold air. As they set off down a rutted road, the fog thickened, obscuring the landscape and muffling the sound of the horses' hooves. How did it happen, Silas? William asked, breaking the oppressive silence. How did Marcus die? The old man's hands tightened on the reins. It's not for me to say, sir. Strange things happen at Ebon Hollow. Always have. Your brother. He changed in the weeks before his passing, muttering to himself, locking himself away in the library for days on end. And then one night... Silas trailed off, shaking his head. What? William pressed. What happened that night? Silas turned, his rheumy eyes filled with a nameless dread. The screaming began, sir. Such terrible screaming. And when we finally broke down the door to the east wing, we found him, or what was left of him. William recoiled, a chill creeping up his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Before he could demand more details, the carriage crested a hill, and there it was, Ebon Hollow. The mansion loomed before them, a grotesque silhouette against the lightening sky. Turrets and chimneys jutted at odd angles, as if the very architecture of the place defied natural law. Tendrils of mist curled around the foundation like spectral fingers, and for a moment William could have sworn he saw movement in one of the upper windows. A fleeting shadow, there and gone in an instant. As they approached the grand entrance, William noticed strange symbols carved into the stone archway above. They seemed to writhe and shift as he looked at them, and he quickly averted his gaze, telling himself it was a trick of the light. The carriage came to a stop and Silas helped William with his luggage. As they climbed the worn steps to the front door, William couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching him, assessing him. The door swung open with a groan before either of them could reach for the handle. "Welcome home, Master William," Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mind where you step. The floors aren't always where you'd expect them to be." With a deep breath, William crossed the threshold into Ebon Hollow. The door slammed shut behind him with a resounding boom, and in that moment, he knew with chilling certainty that his life would never be the same. The foyer of Ebon Hollow engulfed William in shadows, the weak light filtering through grimy windows doing little to dispel the gloom. Dust motes danced in the air, swirling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if moved by unseen currents. "Your room has been prepared in the west wing, sir," Silas murmured, his voice oddly muffled in the cavernous space. "I'd advise against wandering. The house, it has a way of leading the unwary astray." Before William could question this cryptic warning, a new voice cut through the stillness. "Ah, William, at last you've arrived." Jeremiah Crow, the family solicitor, emerged from a side door. He was a gaunt man, his skin sallow and eyes sunken, as if the very essence of Ebon Hollow had leached the vitality from him. "My condolences on your loss," Crow continued, extending a cold, bony hand. "There is much to discuss, but first you must be weary from your journey. Silas will show you to your quarters." As William followed Silas up a grand staircase, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Portraits of Hargrave ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to track his movements. One painting, in particular, caught his attention. A severe-looking woman in Victorian dress, her face twisted in an expression of terror or ecstasy. It was hard to tell which. "That's your great-great-grandmother Cordelia," Silas offered, noticing William's gaze. "They say she was the first to hear the whispers." "Whispers?" William asked, a chill running down his spine. Silas merely shook his head and continued up the stairs. The west wing corridor stretched before them, doors lining either side. As they walked, William could have sworn the hallway elongated, the far end receding into darkness. He blinked, and suddenly they were at his room, though he couldn't recall covering the distance. "Here we are, sir," Silas said, pushing open a heavy oak door. "Try to get some rest, and remember, if you hear anything in the night, anything at all, best to keep your door locked tight." With that ominous advice, Silas shuffled away, leaving William alone in a room that felt both oppressively small and impossibly vast. A four-poster bed dominated the space, its curtains stirring slightly, though there was no breeze. Bookshelves lined the walls, their contents a mix of ancient tomes and newer volumes, many bearing his brother's name on their spines. Exhausted from his journey and the weight of unease that permeated Ebon Hollow, William sank onto the bed. As his eyes drifted shut, he thought he heard something, a faint scratching, as if something were moving within the walls. Scritch, scritch, scritch. He sat bolt upright, heart pounding. The sound ceased immediately, leaving only the hollow silence of the house. Convinced he had imagined it, William lay back down, but sleep eluded him. As night fell, shadows deepened in the corners of the room. The scratching returned, louder now, accompanied by what sounded like whispering, a susurration of voices just below the threshold of comprehension. William pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside his own head. Suddenly, a book flew from one of the shelves, landing with a thud on the floor. It lay open, pages ruffling as if caught in a phantom wind. Against his better judgment, William rose and approached it. His blood ran cold as he read the title, Liber Tenebris, on the summoning of that which lies beyond. The whispering grew to a fever pitch, and William could almost make out words. "The veil grows thin. He comes. He comes." A scream built in William's throat, but before it could escape, everything went silent. The book snapped shut of its own accord, and the room was plunged into an unnatural stillness. In that moment of terrifying quiet, a new sound reached William's ears. Footsteps in the corridor outside, slow and deliberate, approaching his door. The handle began to turn, metal scraping against metal in the silence. William stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe as the door slowly, inexorably began to open. The door creaked open, revealing not a spectral apparition, but the haggard face of Jeremiah Crow. The solicitor's eyes were wild, darting about the room as if expecting to find some lurking horror. "Mr. Hargrave," he wheezed, "my apologies for the intrusion, but I heard noises. Is everything all right?" William's heart thundered in his chest as he struggled to find his voice. Yes, I believe so." Just settling in, Crow's gaze fell upon the book on the floor, his face paling visibly. "I see you found some of your brother's research materials. I'd advise caution, William. There are things in this house best left undisturbed." Before William could respond, a distant crash echoed through the mansion, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Crow spun around, his entire body tensing. "It started again," he muttered, more to himself than to William. "Come quickly, there's something you need to see." Bewildered and still shaken, William followed Crow through the twisting corridors of Ebon Hollow. The house seemed to shift around them, hallways stretching and contracting, doors appearing where none had been before. At last, they arrived at what appeared to be a study, its walls lined with arcane symbols and diagrams. In the center of the room stood a massive desk, its surface covered in papers and strange artifacts. But what drew William's attention was the shattered mirror hanging on the far wall, its fragmented surface reflecting distorted images of the room. And something else, something that seemed to move in the spaces between the broken shards. "This was your brother's sanctuary," Crow explained, his voice hushed. "It was here that he conducted his experiments." "Experiments?" William asked, a sense of dread growing in the pit of his stomach. "What kind of experiments?" Crow hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a leather-bound journal. "Perhaps it's best if I let Marcus explain. This is his final diary. I've held on to it, unsure whether to destroy it or pass it on. But now that you're here, I believe it's rightfully yours." With trembling hands, William took the journal and opened it to the last entry. The handwriting was frantic, barely legible, as if written in great haste or terror. October 13th. "The boundary between worlds grows thinner with each passing night. I can hear them now even when I'm awake. The rituals in the Liber Tenebris have opened a door that I fear cannot be closed. The entity, the thing that has haunted our family for generations, it's not just a curse or a phantom. It's something far older, far more terrible. I've seen it in the mirrors, glimpsed its true form in the fractured reflections. It feeds on our fear, our despair, twisting time and space within these walls to trap us in endless cycles of horror. I thought I could control it, harness its power, but I was a fool. William, if you're reading this, I'm sorry, I've doomed us all. The house is alive, brother. It has always been alive, and now it hungers. There's only one way to end this, to break the cycle. You must." The entry ended abruptly, a dark stain obscuring the final words. William looked up at Crow, his mind reeling. What happened to him? What did Marcus do? Crow shook his head sadly. "We don't know. He was found in this room, or what was left of him. But whatever occurred that night, it awakened something in the house. The disturbances have been growing stronger ever since." As if in response to Crow's words, a low, rumbling groan emanated from the very foundations of the mansion. The floor beneath their feet began to tremble, and the shattered mirror on the wall seemed to ripple, its broken pieces realigning into impossible geometries. In its warped surface, William caught a glimpse of something vast and alien, a writhing mass of shadows and tentacles, punctuated by countless unblinking eyes. He stumbled backward, a scream catching in his throat. "We need to leave now," Crow shouted, grabbing William's arm and pulling him towards the door. But as they reached the threshold, the doorway began to twist and warp, the wood grain flowing like liquid. The house was changing, reshaping itself around them, and William realized with growing horror that they were now trapped in the heart of Ebon Hollow's nightmare. The study door slammed shut with a thunderous boom, sealing William and Crow inside. The walls pulsed with an unholy light, shadows dancing across surfaces that seemed to breathe and undulate. William's mind reeled, struggling to process the impossible geometries that the room had taken on. "What's happening?" he gasped, pressing his back against what he hoped was still a solid wall. Crow's face was ashen, his eyes wide with terror. The house, It's reconfiguring itself. I've seen it before, but never like this. It's as if the very fabric of reality is unraveling around us. A cacophony of whispers filled the air, unintelligible yet somehow laden with malice. The floor beneath their feet began to tilt, objects sliding across the warped surface as gravity itself seemed to lose its hold. "We need to find a way out," William shouted over the growing din. "There has to be." His words were cut short as the floor suddenly gave way, plunging them into darkness. They fell, tumbling through a void that seemed to stretch for an eternity. William's stomach lurched, his sense of up and down completely lost in the inky blackness. After what felt like hours or perhaps mere seconds, they crashed onto a hard surface. Pain lanced through William's body, but the fall hadn't killed them. Somehow that fact was more terrifying than comforting. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, William realized they were in a vast cavernous space. The air was thick and musty, carrying the scent of decay and something else, an alien coppery tang that made his skin crawl. "Crow?" he called out, his voice echoing strangely in the darkness. "Are you there?" A groan answered him, and William fumbled in his pocket for a box of matches. Striking one, he held it aloft, the small flame casting flickering shadows across their new surroundings. They were in what appeared to be ancient catacombs, stretching out in all directions. Crumbling stone arches supported a ceiling lost in darkness, and the walls were lined with niches containing remains. But these were no ordinary human remains. The skeletal forms were twisted and malformed, bearing extra limbs or misshapen skulls that no earthly creature should possess. Crow staggered to his feet, clutching his arm. "The foundations," he muttered. "We've fallen into the very bowels of Ebon Hollow." As they stood trying to gather their wits, a sound reached their ears, a rhythmic wet pulsing like the beating of a monstrous heart. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through the stone beneath their feet. "We need to move," Crow urged, his voice tight with barely contained panic. "Find a way back up, back to the surface." They set off down one of the tunnels, the matchlight casting grotesque shadows as they passed row after row of the inhuman remains. William couldn't shake the feeling that the empty eye sockets were following their progress, silent witnesses to their descent into madness. As they walked, William noticed strange markings carved into the walls, symbols similar to those he had seen in Marcus's study, but older, cruder. They seemed to writhe and shift in the corner of his vision, forming patterns that hurt his mind to contemplate. "What are these?" he asked, tracing a finger along one of the carvings. Crow slapped his hand away. "Don't touch them. They're protection of a sort, wards to keep something contained. Your ancestors knew the danger that lurked beneath Ebon Hollow. They tried to bind it, to keep it from fully manifesting in our world. But they failed," William said, the realization dawning on him with horrifying clarity. "Whatever's down here, it's breaking free." As if in response to his words, a low moan echoed through the tunnels, a sound of such profound anguish and alien hunger that it shook William to his very core. The beating grew louder, faster, and the air itself seemed to thicken, making it difficult to breathe. "Run!" Crow shouted, but it was too late. The tunnel behind them collapsed in a shower of stone and dust. As they turned to flee, William caught a glimpse of something emerging from the rubble, a mass of writhing tentacles and glistening iridescent flesh. Eyes opened along its surface, too many to count, all fixing upon them with ravenous intent. They sprinted through the catacombs, twisting and turning, no longer caring about finding their way back. All that mattered was escaping the horror that pursued them. But with each turn, each branching path, William couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded, driven deeper into the heart of Ebon Hollow's eldritch nightmare. As they rounded another corner, they found themselves face to face with a massive stone door, covered in more of the arcane symbols. Crow threw his weight against it, but it wouldn't budge. "Help me," he cried, desperation clear in his voice. William joined him, pushing with all his might. Slowly, agonizingly, the door began to move. But as a sliver of light appeared, William heard Crow let out a strangled gasp. He turned to see a tendril wrapped around the solicitor's leg, pulling him back into the darkness. "Go!" Crow screamed, his face contorted in terror. "Find the truth, William, end this madness." Before William could react, Crow was yanked into the shadows with inhuman speed. His scream echoed through the tunnels, cut short by a sickening wet crunch. Heart pounding, bile rising in his throat, William squeezed through the opening. The door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the sounds of pursuit. He found himself in a new chamber, dimly lit by phosphorescent fungi growing along the walls. In the center of the room stood an altar of black stone, and upon it lay a book bound in what looked unsettlingly like human skin. As William approached, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain, he saw the title etched in gold on its cover. The Hargrave Legacy, a Chronicle of Shadows. With trembling hands, knowing that the answers he sought and the horrors that awaited lay within its pages, William reached for the tome. William's fingers trembled as he opened The Hargrave Legacy, a Chronicle of Shadows. The leather binding felt unnaturally warm to the touch, almost alive. As he turned the first page, the text seemed to writhe and shift before settling into legibility. The book began with an account dated 1692. I, Ezekiel Hargrave, do hereby record the true origins of our family's curse. We came to these lands seeking a new beginning, but what we found was an ancient evil beyond mortal comprehension. William read on, his horror growing with each revelation. The Hargraves had not simply stumbled upon this land. They had been drawn here by an eldritch entity that existed beyond the veil of reality. This being, referred to only as the Dweller in the Void, had whispered promises of power and knowledge to Ezekiel's dreams. In exchange for this forbidden wisdom, the Hargraves had agreed to build their home, Ebon Hollow, atop a nexus of otherworldly energy. The house was designed as a conduit, a bridge between worlds that would allow the Dweller to slowly manifest in our reality. But Ezekiel had underestimated the price of such power. The entity's influence corrupted the land and the family's bloodline. Madness and death became the Hargrave legacy, each generation paying the price for their ancestors' hubris. As William flipped through the pages, he saw desperate attempts by his forebears to contain the growing threat. Rituals of binding, arcane geometries woven into the very architecture of Ebon Hollow, sacrifices made in dark cellars, all efforts to hold back the encroaching horror. He came across an entry from his great-grandmother Cordelia. The whispers grow stronger with each passing day. I see things in the mirrors that should not be, glimpses of a realm that defies sanity. The house itself has become a living thing, shifting and changing to accommodate its true master's whims. We are no longer its inhabitants, but its prisoners. William's breath caught as he reached the final entries written in his brother's frantic hand. I thought I could master the power that flows through Ebon Hollow, use it to pierce the veil and gaze upon the truths of the universe. But I was a fool. The rituals I performed have weakened the barriers, and now the Dweller stirs in its slumber. There's only one way to end this cycle of madness and horror. The house must be destroyed, the nexus sealed. But the entity fights against its own destruction. It bends time and space within these walls, trapping us in loops of terror, feeding on our fear and despair. William, if you're reading this, know that I'm sorry. I've doomed us all. But there might still be hope. In the deepest chamber beneath Ebon Hollow lies the Heartstone, the anchor that binds the Dweller to this realm. Destroy it, and you might just save us all. The final page was stained with what William now realized was his brother's blood. As he closed the book, a sense of grim determination settled over him. He finally understood the weight of his family's legacy and the cosmic horror that threatened not just Ebon Hollow, but potentially the entire world. A low rumble shook the chamber, dust falling from the ceiling. The entity was aware of his presence, of his newfound knowledge. William knew he had to act fast. He scanned the room, looking for any clue that might lead him to the Heartstone. His eyes fell upon a section of wall covered in more of the shifting arcane symbols. As he watched, they rearranged themselves, forming a map of the catacombs beneath Ebon Hollow. A pulsing point of light on the map indicated his current location, and far below, in the deepest reaches of the underground labyrinth, a crimson glow marked what could only be the Heartstone's chamber. The wall to his right suddenly liquefied, stone flowing like water to reveal a new passageway. The house, or the entity controlling it, was changing again. But whether to aid or hinder his progress, William couldn't be sure. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. The whispers that had been at the edge of his consciousness grew louder, a cacophony of alien voices urging him to turn back, to give in to despair. But William Hargrave stood firm. He was the last of his line, and he would either end his family's curse or die trying. With the Eldritch book tucked securely under his arm, he stepped into the newly formed tunnel, descending further into the nightmare realm beneath Ebon Hollow. As he ventured deeper, the walls seemed to pulse with an unholy light. Shadows danced at the edge of his vision, taking on forms that his mind refused to fully comprehend. The air grew thick and oppressive, carrying the scent of decay and something far older, the musty odor of eons-old evil stirring from its slumber. William pressed on, knowing that somewhere in the depths below the Heartstone waited. And with it, the final confrontation that would determine not just his fate, but potentially the fate of reality itself. William's descent into the bowels of Ebon Hollow was a nightmarish journey through ever-shifting corridors and impossible geometries. The deeper he went, the more the laws of physics seemed to unravel around him. Gravity fluctuated wildly. One moment he was walking on the floor, the next on the walls or ceiling, his sense of up and down completely lost. The whispers that had plagued him since his arrival grew to a fever pitch, a cacophony of alien voices that threatened to shred his sanity. William clutched the Chronicle of Shadows to his chest like a talisman, using it to anchor himself to reality as the world twisted around him. As he rounded a corner, William found himself in a vast chamber filled with mirrors of all shapes and sizes. Each reflective surface showed a different scene, some from his own past, others from futures that might be, and still others from realms beyond human comprehension. In one mirror, he saw himself as a child, playing in the grounds of Ebon Hollow, blissfully unaware of the horror that lurked beneath. In another, he witnessed an older version of himself, driven mad by the entity, performing unspeakable rituals in the mansion's attic. But it was the third mirror that truly chilled him to the bone. In its depths, he saw a world consumed by darkness, writhing tentacles blotting out the sun as cities crumbled and humanity screamed in terror. The dweller in the void, fully manifested, its true form too vast and alien to be fully perceived. "This is what will come to pass if you fail," a voice whispered, and William spun to find himself face to face with himself. Or rather, a version of himself, eyes wild with madness and clothes caked with dirt and blood. What are you?" William stammered, backing away from his doppelganger. The other William grinned, a rictus of pain and insanity. "I am you, brother. A you from a future where we failed to destroy the Heartstone, where we succumbed to the whispers and became a willing vessel for the dweller's emergence." "No," William shook his head in denial. "I won't let that happen. I'll end this here and now." His double laughed, a sound that echoed with otherworldly resonance. "You still don't understand, do you? Time has no meaning here. All possibilities exist simultaneously. In one reality, you succeed. In countless others, you fail. The dweller feeds on all of them, growing stronger with each cycle." As the doppelganger spoke, the mirrors around them began to shatter one by one, each breaking reality, unleashing a wave of chaotic energy that buffeted William. He stumbled, nearly dropping the Chronicle of Shadows. "The path forward is through your own reflection," his mad self intoned. "But beware. What lies beyond the glass may break your mind as surely as your body." With those cryptic words, the doppelganger melted away like smoke, leaving William alone in the chamber of broken mirrors. Only one remained intact, a full-length mirror of obsidian glass that seemed to drink in the light around it. William approached it cautiously, his reflection a dark silhouette against its inky surface. As he drew closer, he felt a pull, as if the mirror were trying to draw him in. He resisted, but the force grew stronger, the whispers urging him to give in, to embrace the madness. With a cry of defiance, William clutched the Chronicle tighter and plunged forward. The surface of the mirror rippled like black water as he passed through, and he found himself falling once more into darkness. He landed hard on a surface that felt organic, yielding beneath his weight. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, William realized with horror that he was standing on what appeared to be living tissue, pulsing, veined, and warm to the touch. The chamber he found himself in was vast, its dimensions shifting and changing as he watched. Great pillars of writhing flesh supported a ceiling lost in shadows, and in the center of the room, pulsing with an otherworldly light, stood a massive crystalline structure, the Heartstone. But between William and his goal lay a sea of nightmarish creatures, things that defied description, amalgamations of flesh, tentacles, and too many eyes. They turned as one to face him, a chorus of inhuman shrieks filling the air. The dweller in the void was aware of his presence, and it had no intention of letting him reach the Heartstone without a fight. As the horde of eldritch horrors surged towards him, William Hargrave steeled himself for the battle of his life, and quite possibly, the fate of all reality. With the Chronicle of Shadows in one hand and a desperate plan forming in his mind, William charged forward, determined to end his family's curse or die trying. The final confrontation had begun, and the very fabric of existence hung in the balance. The air in the chamber crackled with eldritch energy as William faced the horde of nightmarish creatures. Each step he took on the pulsating organic floor sent ripples of awareness through the vast room, as if the very space itself was an extension of the dweller's consciousness. William's mind raced, searching for a way to combat these impossible horrors. As if in answer to his desperation, the Chronicle of Shadows in his hand began to heat up, its pages flipping of their own accord. Glancing down, he saw symbols and incantations glowing on the yellowed paper, the accumulated knowledge and power of generations of Hargraves who had fought against this evil. Without fully understanding how, William began to chant, the alien words burning his throat as they left his lips. A shimmering barrier sprang up around him just as the first wave of monstrosities crashed against it. Tentacles and claws scrabbled at the magical shield, leaving streaks of ichor that sizzled and evaporated. But William knew the barrier wouldn't hold forever. He began to push forward, each step a monumental effort as the sea of flesh and horror parted around his protective bubble. The Heartstone pulsed in the distance, its crimson light seeming to mock his efforts. As he fought his way forward, reality itself began to warp and twist. The chamber stretched and contracted, distances becoming meaningless. One moment the Heartstone seemed within reach, the next it was impossibly far away. The dweller was toying with him, trying to break his will and shatter his sanity. Suddenly a tendril of darkness lashed out, piercing William's barrier. Pain exploded in his mind as alien thoughts and memories flooded his consciousness. He saw eons pass in an instant, witnessed the birth and death of universes, experienced the cold, vast emptiness of the void between realities. William fell to his knees, the chronicle slipping from his grasp. The horrors closed in, their hungry maws and grasping appendages reaching for him. In that moment of despair, he heard a voice, not the maddening whispers of the dweller, but something familiar and warm. "Get up, William," Marcus's voice echoed in his mind. "You're stronger than this. Our family's strength flows through your veins. Use it." With a cry of defiance, William snatched up the chronicle and surged to his feet. He began to chant again, but this time, he wove his own will and determination into the words. The barrier around him exploded outward in a nova of purifying light, incinerating the nearest creatures and carving a path towards the Heartstone. William ran, his feet barely touching the ground as he sprinted through the gap in the hordes. The flesh pillars around him began to collapse, raining viscera and bone as the chamber shook with the dweller's fury. The very air seemed to thicken, trying to slow his progress, but William pushed through, his eyes fixed on his goal. As he neared the Heartstone, he saw that it wasn't just a crystal. It was a window into another realm, a swirling vortex of chaos and madness. Within its depths, he caught glimpses of a vast, tentacled form stirring, preparing to cross the threshold into our reality. The chronicle burned white-hot in William's hands, responding to the proximity of such concentrated evil. He raised the book high, prepared to smash it against the Heartstone, when a voice like the death of stars boomed through the chamber. "Foolish mortal." The dweller's voice reverberated through William's body, threatening to tear him apart at the molecular level. "You cannot destroy me. I am eternal, inevitable. I have existed since before your universe was born, and I will persist long after it has crumbled to dust." The voice was accompanied by visions of such cosmic horror that William felt his mind beginning to fracture. He saw the true form of the Dweller, a being of such vast alien geometry that it defied comprehension, existing simultaneously across multiple dimensions and realities. "Perhaps," William gritted out, fighting to maintain his sanity, "but I can damn well send you back to sleep." With the last of his strength, William brought the Chronicle of Shadows down upon the Heartstone. There was a moment of impossible silence, as if the universe itself held its breath. Then, with a sound like reality tearing apart, the crystal shattered. A shockwave of energy exploded outward, flinging William across the chamber. As he fell, he saw the Heartstone implode, collapsing in on itself and taking the horde of nightmarish creatures with it. The Dweller's scream of rage and frustration echoed across dimensions, growing fainter as the portal closed. William hit the ground hard, his vision blurring. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was the chamber crumbling around him, Ebon Hollow collapsing as the otherworldly energy that had sustained it for centuries finally dissipated. As consciousness slipped away, William allowed himself a small smile. He had done it. The curse was broken. The Hargrave legacy, for better or worse, had come to an end. But in the deepest recesses of his mind, as he teetered on the brink of oblivion, William heard a faint whisper, an echo of the Dweller's voice, filled with malevolent promise. "Sleep now, little Hargrave, but know this, I am patient, I am eternal, and when you least expect it, I will return." The darkness claimed William then, leaving the fate of Ebon Hollow and perhaps reality itself uncertain. William Hargrave awoke to the sterile smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of hospital machinery. His eyes fluttered open, struggling to adjust to the harsh fluorescent lighting. For a moment, he lay there, disoriented, wondering if everything he had experienced had been nothing more than a fevered nightmare. But the aches that permeated his body and the haunted look in his own eyes reflected in the window beside his bed told him otherwise. It had all been real, terrifyingly, mind-shatteringly real. Days passed in a blur of medical examinations and police questioning. The official story was that Ebon Hollow had collapsed due to structural instability, a tragic accident that had claimed the lives of Jeremiah Crow and several others. William, they said, had been lucky to survive. If only they knew the truth. As he recovered, William pieced together what had happened after he lost consciousness. Local authorities had found him amid the rubble of Ebon Hollow, clutching a charred book, the Chronicle of Shadows, now reduced to ashes. The mansion itself had been utterly destroyed, leaving behind nothing but a smoldering crater. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, William began to rebuild his life. He sold what remained of the Hargrave estate, using the money to travel, to seek out remote places untouched by the cosmic horrors he had witnessed. But no matter how far he roamed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that somewhere beyond the veil of reality, the Dweller was biding its time. On sleepless nights, William would find himself drawn to mirrors, half expecting to see glimpses of impossible geometries or alternate realities. The whispers that had plagued him in Ebon Hollow were gone, but in the silence, he sometimes thought he could hear the faintest echo of that alien voice promising its return. A year after the events at Ebon Hollow, William sat in a small cafe in a bustling city, thousands of miles from the ruins of his ancestral home. As he sipped his coffee, his gaze fell upon the headline of a discarded newspaper. "Strange phenomena reported worldwide, experts baffled." The article spoke of inexplicable events occurring across the globe, bizarre weather patterns, unexplained disappearances, and people claiming to have seen impossible things in the shadows. A chill ran down William's spine as he read, recognizing the telltale signs of a world whose boundaries with the unknown had been irreparably weakened. Had his actions at Ebon Hollow truly sealed the breach, or had they merely delayed the inevitable? Had destroying the Heartstone actually weakened the barriers between realities, allowing the Dweller's influence to seep through in subtler, more insidious ways? As these questions swirled in his mind, William's eyes were drawn to a figure reflected in the cafe window, a man who looked remarkably like Jeremiah Crow, watching him from across the street. But when William turned to look, the figure was gone, vanished into the crowd as if it had never been there at all. William rubbed his eyes, unsure if what he had seen was real or a product of his still fragile psyche. He knew then that his battle was far from over. The Hargrave legacy, it seemed, was not so easily shed. Leaving some money on the table, William stood and walked out into the busy street. He had work to do. Somewhere out there were answers, perhaps in forgotten tomes like the Chronicle of Shadows, or in the whispered legends of other families touched by cosmic forces beyond human comprehension. The Dweller might return one day, but this time William would be ready. He was no longer the naive man who had stepped into Ebon Hollow all those months ago. He had gazed into the abyss, had felt the weight of realities beyond his own, and had emerged changed, but unbroken. As he disappeared into the crowded city streets, William Hargrave carried with him the knowledge that the world was far stranger and more terrifying than most could imagine. But he also carried hope. Hope that with vigilance and courage, humanity could stand against the darkness that lurked at the edges of existence. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city. And in those shadows, just for a moment, one might have glimpsed shapes that defied description, a reminder that while the haunting of Ebon Hollow had ended, the true battle for reality had only just begun. 5 years had passed since the fall of Ebon Hollow, yet for William Hargrave, the echoes of that fateful night reverberated through every moment of his existence. He had transformed from a skeptical heir to a man haunted by knowledge of cosmic terrors, dedicating his life to tracking and containing the spreading influence of the Dweller. William's small apartment in New York City served as his base of operations, its walls covered in maps, newspaper clippings, and esoteric symbols. String-connected, seemingly unrelated events across the globe. Unexplained disappearances in Tokyo, mass hallucinations in São Paulo, ancient artifacts unearthed in Egypt that defied scientific explanation. As he pored over his latest findings, a knock at the door startled William from his reverie. He opened it cautiously, revealing a woman in her mid-40s with streaks of gray in her dark hair and eyes that spoke of having seen too much. "Dr. Elena Vasquez," she introduced herself, extending a hand. "I believe we have a mutual interest in certain otherworldly matters." William ushered her in, his curiosity piqued. Dr. Vasquez explained that she was part of a clandestine group of scholars and investigators who had been monitoring global anomalies for decades. They had noted a significant spike in unexplained phenomena since the destruction of Ebon Hollow. "We believe that when you shattered the Heartstone, Mr. Hargrave, you didn't just banish the Dweller," Elena explained, her voice grave. "You fractured the barriers between realities. The entity's influence is seeping through the cracks, manifesting in ways we're only beginning to understand." She produced a folder filled with reports and photographs. William's blood ran cold as he examined them. Images of people with extra limbs or misshapen features, eerily reminiscent of the twisted remains he had seen in Ebon Hollow's catacombs. There were accounts of time distortions, of entire towns vanishing only to reappear days later with no memory of what had transpired. "We need your help, Mr. Hargrave," Elena said. "Your experience with the Dweller, your family's legacy, they make you uniquely qualified to assist us in combating this threat." William hesitated, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. But he knew he couldn't turn away from this fight. "What do you need me to do?" Elena smiled grimly. "We've located several nexus points around the world, places where the barrier between realities is particularly thin. We believe these might be potential sites for the Dweller to attempt a full manifestation. We need to secure and study these locations before it's too late." As they discussed the details of their mission, William felt a mix of dread and excitement. This was his chance to make amends for his family's role in nearly unleashing cosmic horror upon the world, to use the cursed knowledge he had gained for the greater good. But even as he agreed to join Elena's group, a part of William wondered if they were already too late. In the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the window, and for just a moment, he could have sworn he saw tentacles writhing beneath his skin, a reminder that the Dweller's touch was not so easily escaped. As William packed a bag for their first expedition, a journey to a remote island in the South Pacific where locals spoke of gods rising from the sea. He steeled himself for the battles to come. The haunting of Ebon Hollow might have ended, but the war against cosmic forces beyond human comprehension was just beginning. In the sky above New York, storm clouds gathered, their patterns forming impossible geometries visible only to those who knew where to look. And somewhere in the vast, uncaring universe, in a realm beyond mortal understanding, the dweller stirred in its slumber, its countless eyes fixed upon the thin membrane separating its domain from our reality. The tendrils of the void were spreading, and William Hargrave stood as one of humanity's few informed defenders against the encroaching darkness. As he left his apartment, boarding a plane bound for the unknown, William couldn't shake the feeling that this was merely the beginning of a much larger, more terrifying story, one that would determine the fate of not just Earth, but of reality itself.